Will Bird stood in a muddy field that looked more like the surface of the moon than a pastoral landscape. 100 days of German bombing had completely mutilated the countryside, leaving it void of grass and every scrap of the former green complexion that had once blanketed it. The only vestiges of its former life were the now barren, branchless trees spiking out of the clay like bony fingers, pointing to the godless skies from which artillery had rained its ordnance on the land. As far as the eye could see, all that remained were muddy craters, cross-stitched in a web of twisted, mangled loops of barbed wire that had snagged, clutched, and hampered advancing ground forces. The crater formed a mottled expanse of brown and gray ponds filled with ankle-deep water left by the rains that had wept over the land during the long battle. "It's not enough that we're fighting and killing one another," Will posited, "but we always seem to be doing it with our boots and kits caked in mud." He drew a few eyes from his platoon mates, but he was mostly talking to himself. He smirked and looked up at the beautiful blue sky that seemed to have emerged to welcome the end of the fighting. He was glad for the warmth of this morning's bright sunshine. The Battle of Amiens was over, and the Germans had been driven back and beaten down. There seemed to be little more left to this war to end all wars for Germany and the Central Powers. They had been demoralized, and they no longer even held a dim hope of victory on the Western Front. In the corner of his eye, Will caught a small glint of movement. With little concern and barely any attention at all, he absently turned his head to look at what would probably be just a flitting bird or field mouse or some light scrap of something skittering across the ground in the breeze. What he saw, however, made him come to a complete and full stop. Standing at the edge of a shallow crater, not but a few feet away from Will, was a man, or a vision of a man, or a ghostly apparition of a man, dressed in what appeared to be some sort of ancient armor. He was brilliantly lucent and utterly incorporeal. The ghostly man, if you could call it a man, was looking down to the ground at his feet, where there was something black protruding from the mud. Then he was gone. Will only had a glimmering wisp of a moment in which, after it had passed, he was left wholly unsure of what he had just seen, if it had actually been there at all. He was instantly brought back to the moment when he saw his little brother in the late afternoon sunlight of that Saskatchewan wheat field. A moment there, and then the next, nothing. Nothing and no one, but for a deformed mound of churned-up mud and clay. Will's mouth dropped open, but he uttered only a whispering intake of breath. He started to wonder if he was suffering from a battle-induced illusion of some sort when his eye fixed on the ground where the ghostly warrior had been standing. There in the clay protruded something that looked like blackened metal, perhaps a piece of gear twisted in one of the explosions. He stooped and looked at it a bit closer. "Is that a bayonet?" he asked out loud. As his fellow soldiers kept walking on ahead, Will reached down and touched the upper end of the thing. Immediately, without even thinking, he let his hand slip down into a grip around a shaft that felt for a moment very much like the handle of a harvesting scythe. He tightened his grip and pulled. With a slight sucking sound, the clay let loose, and out came what seemed to be, of all things, a sword. In his hand it seemed to send a wave of something up his arm. Nothing overt and physical, a little less even than a feeling. A breeze lilted and gently brushed across his face. He could feel strength. He was suddenly brushed with a feeling of loyalty and honor. They weren't in-your-face energies of sorts, but the things that were much more subtle. Ideas of emotions glimmering on the air. Will held it out in front of his face, the tip pointing to the sky. Small clods of wet clay dropped to the mud at his feet. It was, without question, a sword, but not at all like a cavalry blade or any sort of bayonet with which he was familiar. It felt so much older. He wiped his hand down the blade to remove the mire. The cutting edge was dull with time. What emerged was a 2.5-foot-long, age-blackened blade, heavily corroded from being buried in the moist ground for, centuries? The grip had rotted away, leaving only the metal tang and a few small, twisted loops of thin metal that must have held the wooden handle in place. Wait a minute, Will said to himself, noticing the deep pockmarking on the metal. This isn't just old, it's ancient. He couldn't immediately remember the name for what it was called, but from his memory, he at least knew what a Roman sword looked like. It's a gladius, Will told himself finally, remembering the word. It's a Roman gladius. But what would it be doing here in France, buried in the clay? With his curiosity afire, he put the old blackened sword into his kit bag, determined to find out more about it. Then he hurried to catch up to his mates so he could find a dry place to sit and shake the mud out of his clothes and gear.